Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is about some spectacular new data tampering by NOAA and NASA, why they're doing it, and what the implications are. This graph shows three different versions of the NASA GISS global land surface temperature anomaly. The blue line is the 2000 version, which showed about 0.5 C warming. The green line is the 2017 version, which showed about 1.5 C warming. And the red line is the just released 2019 version, which shows about 2 degrees Celsius warming. Note that the past in each successive version got progressively cooler. The past in the 2017 version was cooler than the 2000 version, and the past in the 2019 version is even cooler. And at the same time, the present is getting much warmer. Note how they increased temperatures between the 2000 and the 2017 version, and once again between the 2017 and the 2019 versions. So they've quadrupled warming mainly by cooling past temperatures and warming present temperatures. Satellites show that since the year 2000, land temperatures have warmed about 0.2 degrees Celsius. But NASA has increased land warming since the year 2000 by about 1.5 degrees Celsius. So more than 80% of the change since the year 2000 is due to data tampering, and only a small percentage is due to actual warming. Now let's look at why this is being done. This was the global temperature graph from the 1990 IPCC report. It showed that temperatures were much warmer 800 years ago when CO2 levels were very low. This was known as the medieval warm period, and it pretty much destroyed the theory of catastrophic global warming. Around the year 1995, Dr. David Deming at the University of Oklahoma, who is a geologist, received a communication that they needed to erase the medieval warm period. This was his testimony to Congress on December 6, 2006. I had another interesting experience around the time my paper in Science was published. I received an astonishing email from a major researcher in the area of climate change. He said we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. And once again, you can see why they wanted to get rid of the medieval warm period. If we had high temperatures when CO2 was low, that would indicate that other factors in the climate are much stronger than carbon dioxide. But the agenda was to prove that carbon dioxide controlled the climate. So in the year 1999, Michael Mann at Penn State University erased the medieval warm period and created the hockey stick graph, which is now the official document of the global warming religion. The hockey stick graph shows that temperatures cooled steadily since the year 1000, but then suddenly when carbon dioxide hit 280 parts per million, temperatures started skyrocketing. Catherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech University has extended Michael Mann's hockey stick and shown that if we keep CO2 levels above 280 parts per million, temperatures will continue to skyrocket up to, say, plus 5 degrees Celsius. She considers herself to be an evangelical Christian and a prophet of climate doom. But the problem was that in the year 2000, the NASA temperature graph really didn't look much like a hockey stick. So changes needed to be made. But to start this investigation, let's go back a little further to 1974. This was the graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research from 1974. It showed that Earth had cooled a little bit from 1870 to 1970 and cooled very rapidly after the year 1940. That doesn't look much like a hockey stick, and neither did the 1975 National Academy of Sciences graph, which showed pretty much the same thing as the 1974 NCAR graph. Very little warming from 1880 to 1970 and rapid cooling after the year 1940 as greenhouse gases increased. These graphs were bad news for people pushing catastrophic global warming theory. So changes needed to be made. Let's look at what happened between the 2000 version of the NASA temperature graph and the 2017 version. I'm going to flip back and forth between the two versions a few times and you can see what they did. They cooled the past and they warmed the present. They cooled the past and warmed the present. In this animation, I put a blue circle at the low point of the 2017 graph and a red circle at the high point of the 2000 graph. You can see how they stretched out warming by tampering with the data. And they also erased the inconvenient warm data from the 1870s, which was just as warm as the 1970s. But the 2017 version still wasn't scary enough. So they made another round of data tampering over the last 2 years and now show about 2 degrees warming. This animation shows the red and blue circles again and shows how they increase warming from 1.5 degrees Celsius up to 2 degrees Celsius, primarily by tampering with the data since the year 2017. This graph shows the changes made to the temperatures over the last 30 years just since the 2017 version. See, they've increased recent temperatures quite a bit. When you're willing to manipulate data, you can create any result you want, and they wanted to show warming. And all of this data tampering over the last 2 years was done during a period of time when satellites showed that Earth was cooling very quickly. This is satellite temperatures over land from the University of Alabama at Huntsville since the year 2017. It shows about 0.4 C cooling during that period of time. So this rapid cooling was occurring during a time when NASA was rapidly increasing warming by altering their data. So let's look at this graph once again. NASA has created almost all of the warming by cooling the past and warming the present. Very little of it has been actual warming of the Earth's atmosphere. So what's the agenda here? People wanting to control the U.S. energy supply have been pushing this propaganda about 1.5 degrees Celsius warming being the tipping point. So the 0.5 C shown in the NASA 2000 version just wasn't adequate. And the 2017 version, which showed 1.5 C, was barely adequate. So in 2019, they've pushed it up to 2.0 C. So now they demand climate action. And the latest peer-reviewed science shows that essentially all warming over the past 140 years was due to increases in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So climate scientists have erased all the natural variability shown in the 1990 IPCC graph. And now we're on this hockey stick of warming, which started at 280 parts per million CO2. According to climate scientists, the climate tipping point occurred at 280 parts per million CO2. As soon as we got above 280 parts per million, temperatures started skyrocketing. And according to Catherine Hayhoe, temperatures are going to continue to skyrocket. So let's look at the implications of this. If temperatures started skyrocketing at 280 parts per million CO2, the only way we could stop it would be go back to 279 parts per million CO2. We would have to go back to 1870s levels of CO2 in the atmosphere in order to stop this catastrophe from happening. The response I'll get to this from climate scientists is that nobody's saying we have to go back to 280 parts per million, yet that's what their graph shows us we have to do. If you believe in Michael Mann's hockey stick, there's no getting around the fact that the tipping point occurred at 280 parts per million, and that the only way to stop the warming would be to go below 280 ppm CO2. My apologies for repeating this point over and over again, but it's critically important to the discussion. And let's look what happened to Earth after we passed that tipping point. This is an article from 1910. Except over a small area, it is generally understood the glaciers of the world are retreating to the mountains. The glacier on Mount Sarmiento in South America, which descended to the sea when Darwin found it in 1836, is now separated from the shore by a vigorous growth of timber. The Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland has retreated 4 miles since 1850, and the East Glacier in Spitsbergen is more than a mile away from its original terminal. This all occurred before the year 1910. And here's an article from 1947, Warming of Climate Causes Concern. If the Antarctic regions and the major Greenland ice caps should reduce at the same rate as the present melting in the Arctic, oceanic surfaces would rise to catastrophic proportions, and people living in the lowlands along the shores would be inundated. He said that temperatures in the Arctic had increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from a scientific standpoint. The speaker was Dr. Hans Allman, who was considered the world's leading Arctic expert at the time. So according to the latest research, all of this 10 degrees warming in the Arctic was caused by increases in carbon dioxide, and that was before the year 1947, when CO2 levels were still very low. And here's another article from 1952. The rate of melting in the last half-century had been exceedingly rapid. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska, he said, are only half the size they were 50 years ago. The temperature around Spitsbergen is so modified that the sailing time is lengthened from 3 to 8 months of the year. The speaker was Dr. William Carlson, who was president of the University of Vermont and was considered the leading American Arctic expert. So this rapid melting and warming of the Arctic occurred when CO2 levels were not much above 280 parts per million. So if you believe that carbon dioxide controls the temperature on Earth, that means we need to get CO2 levels back below 280 parts per million. We have to go back to 279 parts per million. Glaciers were melting very rapidly before 1910 when CO2 was below 300 parts per million. So basically, climate alarmists believe that we need to go back to a pre-industrial lifestyle in order to save the planet. So now let's look at the implications of this. Billionaire Tom Steyer says that we need to make some sacrifices in order to stop droughts in Central America, which is basically the same belief which the Aztecs had about droughts in Central America. They believed that sacrifice was necessary to control them, just like Tom Steyer does now. So what the Aztecs would do is they would sacrifice people until the drought stopped. And then when the drought came back, they'd sacrifice some more, because obviously they hadn't sacrificed enough previously. Climate alarmists haven't yet gotten to the point of proposing human sacrifice, but they're already proposing that we get our plane travel limited and that we get our cars taken away from us. Climate emergency. Ireland sets to ban private cars while planning mass third world migration. So what will happen is that they'll start making sacrifices, yet we'll continue to get the bad weather which we've always had. This will lead them to believe they need to make some more sacrifices. The same superstitious mentality which the Aztecs had. Superstition is when people make an imaginary link between two unrelated things. During the 16th century, people made an imaginary link between bad weather and witches. The Salem witch trials were probably the result of that, and in Europe they burned thousands of witches at the stake. The belief in the 16th century was that witches caused bad weather, just as people believe now that carbon dioxide causes bad weather. But the bottom line is that we've always had bad weather, we'll always continue to have bad weather, and most of the warming seen is due to data tampering, not carbon dioxide. And there's no way to get CO2 levels below 280 parts per million anyway, which is where the tipping point occurred according to their own graphs. This graph shows CO2 levels in Hawaii since the year 1960, and you can see that they continue to increase. The Paris Climate Accord was passed a few years ago, yet we continue to see CO2 levels accelerating. That's because the United States, Ireland, and the West don't control CO2 levels. Asia emits a lot more carbon dioxide than the United States and Europe do, and they're continuing to build lots of new coal-fired power plants. So Western countries will continue taking away their people's rights and freedoms, they'll continue making energy more expensive, yet CO2 levels will continue to accelerate. And we will still have the same bad weather which Earth has always experienced. Asian countries don't share the mindless climate superstitions of the West. There's no way that carbon dioxide is ever going to get back down below 280 parts per million, which is where Michael Mann's hockey stick shows we have to go. And the whole thing is based on junk science theory, around which data has been massively tampered to support. So who's pushing and financing this insanity? I don't have any idea, but I do know that we need to stop it. Mass superstition and fraudulent junk science has never led to good things in the past, and it certainly won't in the future. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.